During World War II, Germany and Japan committed atrocities, including crimes against peace, conventional war crimes, and crimes against humanity. While Germany has accepted responsibility for the war crimes perpetrated by the Nazi regime through memorials to its victims and through education, Japan has rejected its responsibility and atrocities and has even downplayed historical evidence, even though scholars, students, and many interest groups, including those in Japan, have demanded transparency. The war in Asia started not in 1941, but in 1931, when Japan invaded Manchuria. The Japanese Kwantung Army Chief of Staff, General Kuniaki Koiso, issued harsh orders to control ideological movements, banish political parties, retaliate against civilians for actual or perceived aid to Chinese troops, and wield military power when necessary. Japanese War Minister Sadao Araki transformed these directives by invoking the principles of Haku Ichio and Kodo, the divine right of the emperor to rule the 8 corners of the world. Its principles lie in denying judicial due process and implementing Genju Shobun, meaning harsh disposal or execution on the spot. These methods were used in Shanghai and Nanking in 1937. Both Koiso and Araki were convicted of Class A war crimes against peace after the war. During World War II in the Pacific, Genju Shobun was used in all of the Japanese occupied countries. Public interest in Japanese war crimes arose in the post-war period because of demands from victims, historians, authors, and the media. By February 2000, more than a dozen class action lawsuits had been filed in the United States against Japanese corporations by former Allied prisoners of war, civilian internees, and Asian slave laborers. Because of the unresponsiveness and the denial by government agencies like the CIA to release war records, the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act was passed in 1998 and the Japanese Imperial Government Disclosure Act in 2000. President Clinton created the Interagency Working Group to implement these laws, and it oversaw the largest declassification and release of U.S. government records containing information on Nazi and Japanese war crimes. These included records relating to the treatment of prisoners of war, civilian internees, atrocities against civilian population, the use of chemical and biological warfare agents, sexual enslavement, and the U.S. government's decision after the war not to prosecute Emperor Hirohito and certain war criminals. From a universe of 620 million pages, different government agencies identified a total of 113 million pages that merited screening for possible relevance. Out of these 113 million pages, 8.5 million were identified as relevant material warranting declassification under these 2 acts. The majority of those records related to war crimes in Europe. In contrast, only 142,000 pages related to Japanese war crimes. Why did U.S. government agencies hold far fewer records on Japanese war crimes compared to Nazi war crimes? The U.S. military, not the Office of Strategic Services, had control of most of the Pacific Theater records. There was not a continuing hunt for Japanese perpetrators compared to the Nazis. Records of other nations' war crimes trials are not subject to the Disclosure Acts because they were never in the possession of the U.S. government. The Treaty of Peace with Japan, signed by 49 nations in 1951, ended the post-war occupation of Japan. Japanese war records were returned to Japan starting in the late 1950s until the early 1960s. Between the ceasefire on August 15, 1945, and the arrival of small advance parties of American troops in Japan on August 28, 1945, Japanese military and civil authorities systematically destroyed military, naval, and government archives, especially from the period 1942 to 1945. Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo dispatched enciphered messages to field commands throughout the Pacific, ordering units to burn incriminating evidence of war crimes. In 2003, the director of Japan's Military History Archives of the National Institute for Defense Studies estimated that as much as 70% of the Army's wartime records were burned or destroyed. During the ensuing war crimes trials, 25 high-profile Japanese officials were convicted of Class A war crimes or crimes against peace. Foremost was General Hideki Tojo, the Japanese Prime Minister from October 1941 to July 1944. Hundreds of others were convicted of Class B, or conventional war crimes, and Class C, or crimes against humanity. In the Philippines, General Masaharu Homa, commanding officer of the Japanese 14th Army when the Bataan Death March took place, and General Tomoyuki Yamashita, commanding officer of the Japanese Army in the Philippines from October 1944 till the end of the war, were convicted of Class B war crimes. But there were those who were never prosecuted for war crimes or war crimes against humanity, such as members of Japanese biological and chemical warfare units in China and Singapore. The most infamous one, Unit 731, or the Kwantung Army Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department, was headed by Surgeon General Shiro Ishii. Although he and his team were arrested at the end of the war, the United States gave many of them immunity in exchange for full disclosure of their human biological experimentations. Another war criminal who escaped detention was Colonel Masanobu Tsuji. He was known as the god of military strategy and was considered the chief planner of the successful conquests of Malaya and Singapore, which were carried out by General Tomoyuki Yamashita, known as the Tiger of Malaya. Tsuji was also behind the Sukching Massacre, which claimed the lives of thousands of Singaporean Chinese between February 18 and March 4, 1942. He was a protege of Marshal Hajime Sugiyama, the chief of Imperial Japanese Army General Staff. He was ordered to the Philippines and implemented the brutal treatment of surrendering prisoners of war after the fall of Bataan, including the massacre of approximately 350 Filipino soldiers in the Patingan River. He was also behind the execution of political leaders, such as Chief Justice Jose Abad Santos, the acting president of the Philippine Commonwealth after President Quezon left the Philippines. After the war ended, he was wanted by British authorities as a Class A war criminal for crimes in Singapore, but avoided capture by hiding in Southeast Asia and was later sheltered by Chiang Kai-shek. He was recruited by Major General Charles Willoughby, Chief of Intelligence for the Supreme Commander for Allied Powers. In December 1950, he was taken off the war criminals list by the United States. In 1952, Tsuji was elected to the Japanese Diet under the far-right Liberal Democratic Party. Today, we have a different political landscape than in World War II. But genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes continue to be inflicted on innocent victims all over the world with the same impunity. And the pursuit of truth and justice remain even more elusive. Millions have died and will continue to do so. But we, the living, have a moral obligation, a sacred duty, to bring justice to their memory and to ensure that they will never be forgotten.